And we are back with our new episode of APIM Hotrod. Today we will talk about solution architecture, and we are here with Stephane, as usual. And today we have Rik for the first time. Thank you, Rik, for joining. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, thanks, Massimo. It's really great to be here for the first time, and a pleasure to be talking to both of you.
Likewise. Yeah. So, and you, Stephane, how are you doing?
Yeah, good, as usual. So everything's fine. Excited to see what we're going to be talking about today, Massimo.
Okay, so today is about solution architecture, and let me bring in one of your very famous maps. Here you go. And this is about solution architecture, right? So, Stephane, can you just tell us why you created this type of map?
Yeah, indeed. Maybe just a quick introduction on this. But the goal of these maps is really to depict the Azure landscape, of course, as much as possible. Azure is huge, and so there are even services inside of Azure that are themselves some universes. So, of course, you cannot have like a finite world. But it's also to try to help people find their way, right, in Azure. So if you have to do something, maybe take a concrete example. If you see the node that I see on screen, systems of engagement, in my view, this is something where you want to engage with external parties typically, right? So you're going to have APIs, you're going to have different ways of interacting with third parties. And so then these are the tools, services that you could use, let's say, in Azure that are available to basically build a system of engagement. You see, and that's a bit the idea behind these maps. So we have a node, and we have kind of the leaf nodes, let's say, are the Azure services themselves. And that's like a compass a bit to get to something. Of course, you still need to think deeper on your own to really find if that makes sense for your own use case, of course. That's a bit the idea, Massimo.
Okay. Great. I love it. I mean, I'm a big visualizer. I love big pictures. It helped me to understand my journey throughout the technology. And of course, when we design solution architecture application platform in Azure, we start first from functional requirement, non-functional requirement. Of course, what our customer needs, which kind of problem we want to solve, where we want to deliver value. That's the first most important things. But in my case, for example, then I start in a very classic way when it's about solution architecture. And I ask to myself, okay, how can I ingest data into my platform? How can I process data? Okay, how can I store data? How can I process data? And then how do I present this data to the outside world? This is, I believe, is a very classic approach. And then I start with these 4 groups to then expand throughout all of the bubbles that we have in this map. And my question is to both of you, starting, for example, from Rik, how do you approach solution architecture in Azure? The same way, a different way? What is your opinion?
So I do it in a similar way, but I tend to start with a couple of different questions, Massimo. So I usually start with, are we talking to things inside the house or outside the house, right? By which I mean, are we ingesting data from our customers and partners or sending data to them? Or is this entirely within our own organization? And I also like to try and establish some of the, if you like, those core fundamentals first. Like, what have we got in terms of the constraints and regulations of the industry that we're in, or maybe the security constraints? Because Stephane's map there is absolutely amazing, right? But if the organization says, well, everything has to be inside a virtual network and A and B and C, whatever are the constraints that we've got, then we might need to start crossing some of those services off.
Indeed.
And I always like to know what I'm going to have on the menu in terms of the Azure services that I can work with. Effectively, what Lego bricks are you giving me, and which ones are you taking away? Because I don't want to start architecting a service and solution where then they go, oh, hang on, well, you said you want to use, I don't know, Logic Apps consumption, just to pick something, right?
Yeah, indeed, yeah.
Really, really great, low friction, quick and easy to build, consumption pricing, completely useless if you've got to be inside a virtual network.
indeed. I think I share the same view. So indeed, for me, it's very important to see indeed if it's for your own, and even if it's for your own, right? Sometimes, indeed, if you have regulatory obligations, requirements, but sometimes the security level should be maximum, right? And so some organizations, or most organizations, actually start isolating everything from internet. Indeed, so meaning that the virtual network is indeed not an option but a must, and indeed it excludes some services from the picture because indeed some do not integrate. So that's indeed a good way to look at it. And it's indeed, if you are especially in Massimo, when you work for a consultancy company, right, you might draw something on the corner of the table, and then when you want to ship it to the customer, and then if you did not really indeed look at the way they work, the way they govern their cloud environment, then you, of course, might have unpleasant surprises, of course, because in the end, what you could work fully serverless, frictionless, let's say really cheap, then ends up with something actually more complex, and in the end, very much more expensive. And so indeed, and so in the map, of course, you cannot really show this, right? But there are multiple maps, of course. If you know that you need to equip your stuff with network, then you would actually go to the networking map to see a bit, okay, what do we have in-house? But yeah, that's very valid, Rik.
And that is what Rik said is exactly the approach that I have, and I call it how to translate, for example, functional and not functional requirement into the key architecture principles. That's what so those constraints or whatever, those are the key architecture principles that then drive the trade-off. So that's the first step, then to go into what the fourth step I said. Just like I skip it just for the sake of the discussion. So it's nice to see that on that point, we have more or less the same experience. Okay. Good.
We also need to take into account, right, the skills of the team. I mean, are we contractors? Are we bringing our own devs in which case we know what we know? But the customer has to operate this when we leave, or maybe we're working with an in-house development team, right? So us rocking up and going, well, brilliant, everything's going to be containerized .NET, and they go, well, all of our devs are Java. Things like that also need to fold into the conversation before we start picking our services, because that sort of management operation life cycle is important, and also the maturity of the customer, right? I mean, the show's called APIM Hotrod, right? 9 times out of 10, when I'm building these things, there's some reason I need to put API management in, and often I'm having a conversation with customers about where they are on that sort of cloud maturity journey. And are we actually starting to build them a central capability, even though we might be a small project or the first guys in the door? So sometimes also identifying context is important, right? They might say, well, actually, this project, we want you to move information from system A to system B. But if we're the first project to move information from system A to system B, then you might want to think about all that great foundational stuff and how we put that in such a way as to then enable further development and further projects. So that sort of comes into play as well.
Yeah, indeed. And I think as well, for me, that's also the goal of this map, is to see, okay, my view, and we discussed that in the previous episode, but of a solution architect for Azure, right, is of course that you need to master a bit the end-to-end aspects of a solution. So meaning indeed non-functional requirements, so security, indeed, let's say what already exists in the landscape. Do you have already indeed these central capabilities or not? If not, then you need to build them. So you need at least to know more or less your way to get that built. And I think indeed, and that's a bit the goal of this. It's still a bit high level in this one, right? Because we cannot deep dive into each and every vertical of Azure from a single map. Otherwise, that map would be just huge, right? It would be unreadable. You would need like an entire wall to print it. But at least it gives you, okay, that's why we see about security, we see about monitoring, we see also about CI/CD, not of course saying that the solution architect should know the bits and bytes of how to build a YAML pipeline, for instance, right? But at least, of course, be acquainted with industry practices, and still, if at some point, okay, deployment is failing for some reason, not completely be clueless about what could be happening, you see? And so in the end, solution architect should be kind of T-shape, and somehow be familiar with all these disciplines that we see on the map, right? Of course, it doesn't mean that you need to know all the bits and bytes. And you see here, for instance, Kubernetes, OpenShift. Yeah, who knows that by heart? Both, probably nobody. But if you don't know at all, none of them, then maybe you missed something, right? As a solution architect. So that's a bit, but the landscape is huge, of course.
And also coming back of what Rik was saying about platform capability, just a question like, do you also experience sometimes, most of the time, the other way around, where a customer wants something fit for the purpose and not overthinking too much? It should be of what will come in the future. So like, this is my problem. I want something that fits on the purpose. I don't need, to give an example, I want my Kubernetes cluster for my application. I don't care if this Kubernetes this cluster will be ready for 10, 5, 6 application. It should fit my single application and not the future. So you also have this kind of things every now and then?
Of course.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of those where... So I will preface this by saying I'm not against Kubernetes, but that exact conversation, Massimo, happens so often. Oh, we need to do containers. We need to put Kubernetes in. Really? You're going to have 3 containers. Do you really want to put Kubernetes in for one application with like 3 containers? Use Azure Container Apps. Yeah. So one of the most important things I feel that we can do as consultants and solution architects is challenge those initial customer design decisions that might be more informed from the tech press and dare I say it, fashion, than necessarily what they actually need. And I think actually this diagram does kind of help in that, because it shows clearly what the alternatives are, right? They're all TLAs, God bless them, but it doesn't have to be AKS. It could be ACA. It could even be containers in app services, depending on what we're trying to run, right? So again, not knocking containers as a unit of shipping, but cloud has one failing in my mind, which is it makes it very easy to overcomplicate things. And I always feel that a simple solution architecture is going to be the more successful one, because it's easier to understand, it's easier to manage, it's easier to maintain. Only add complexity as you feel you need that extra functionality, right?
Yeah, the thing is, it's a key question, Massimo, because sometimes I see that a lot of projects are, of course, really project-driven, so they see their own interest, which makes sense. Mm-hmm. And sometimes, of course, indeed, you might have to take shortcuts. Maybe because, not enough money, right? It could be different reasons. That's also why I also do quite a few audits, let's say, from time to time. So I'm always, careful before, blaming anything or anyone, because I know that, some reality might actually explain why we end up in some situations. And I think indeed, I believe in good enough architecture, so not trying to over-engineer. But still, and that's also our role in terms of architect, to see, if you see something that is really definitely a shortcut, but you have to highlight it, right? And then, of course, if in the end the customer makes an informed decision and takes the wrong decision, it's going to be his choice. It's called at the end of the day, you see, but at least we anticipate these kind of things. And indeed, for containers, I think there is no bad choice. It's just indeed, it depends. Also, the maturity, Rik, you mentioned that already earlier. Operating Kubernetes is much more, even though it's becoming easier, right? AKS, is evolving, towards more and more managed from Microsoft. But still, if you indeed have microservices, to take the classical example, AK has been built, a container apps from the ground up for this. And if it is your reality, then it might just be good enough for what you need, and then don't go for AKS, where indeed the complexity is a bit, but it's definitely higher than using just AK or even just web app for containers and so on. So, but as I think that's the trade-off that we are mentioning, Massimo.
Yeah, and another thing, just I wrote down the sentence of Rik that Azure makes it easy to overcomplicate things, and one of the things that we are mentioning in the previous episode is also because if you look between the different container services, like I used the example of ACA and AKS, Microsoft, on purpose, does not make an easy transition between one and the other. It's not that you can say, okay, I have my container, well, I just move it from function, app service, ACA, and Kubernetes seamlessly. So the journey is most of the time a rewrite of something, and even between ACA and AKS, which is one on top of the other, the things is not so obvious. So that's also just I want to add a little bit on top of what Rik was saying.
But the only thing I would add, because we cannot see this, of course, on this map, because unfortunately, I just had the idea now, so I should update the map. But for instance, there are some reasons as well. So ACA for me is very opinionated, right? I mean, again, you want to do microservices and so on, perfect. But you also have quite often actually vendor packages, right? So really packaged by external companies, third parties that you need to adopt and install in your own company. And of course, in that case, it's likely to be packaged for OpenShift or for Kubernetes, right? And of course, in that case, AKS becomes really a central component or central service for this kind of stuff. Really, you see, it really depends on your reality, and I think that's what you said, Rik. So the answer is often it depends, because that's indeed. I mean, it really depends on your reality. So I have many customers that have some vendor packages, and these guys try to be fully agnostic, right? So they, of course, stick to just Kubernetes because they know that you can go that in Google or in AKS, and then and that you will be able to host their packages. You see, so. Again, depends. So if you have such, of course, needs, then the number of services.
Very true. I mean, to illustrate with a couple of real-world examples. So I've been working with 2 customers lately, and one, they're building their own application. As an organization, app dev is not something they really do. Cloud is something that they are adopting. But they're still on the journey, right? Building governance, building security, whatever. And that's a deliberate choice of Azure Container Apps, because they're taking a domain-driven design approach. They're bounded context. We have container apps that are running and doing the processing, SQL DB for data storage, app services hosting an API, APIM across the top to unify all of that. And they made those decisions based on the maturity of the customer and their ability to operate. And they don't have, external organizations going, here is our Helm chart for this thing to deploy. There's a couple of components where we've taken the vendor's container and pulled those into container apps, but that wasn't terribly difficult. By contrast, I've been working with another customer, and strategically, they have said, we want to develop everything in Kubernetes because we want one single platform across the organization and its subsidiaries, right? And they're all doing app development. They wanted to do this in one single unified way to make it easier to have unified deployment and management on operation, because that removes risk and it improves velocity and all that kind of stuff. And it does mean if they buy vendor provided applications, which they do, then it's like, here's the containers, here's the Helm chart, off we go. And that makes perfect sense. Customer 2, however, is further along that cloud maturity management curve than customer 1. So to what you were saying, Stephane, right? The right choice can sometimes be a point in time choice as well. And often the most important thing we can do with our applications is make sure that we review periodically whether we still have the right architecture, or whether a better service has come along, or new functionality and features have come along.
Yeah, and actually that's the key point, because if you see the patterns, for instance, patterns and idioms, that's something that I typically want to review every 6 months. In Azure, because that indeed it's a moving target, so you cannot make a pattern and say, okay, that's a reference for the next 5 years. You can, but if you do that, you will miss some stuff. And so typically at least an annual review or by twice a year. That's for me a good base to see, okay, if it's still in line, that's great, and you don't change anything. But then it's really an opportunity to review, because typically Azure will improve also over time, and some services might have some shortcomings. So especially if you go to the IDOM, so more kind of technical view of how you plan to implement a pattern, then of course that's where the details could change over time. And so these ones really need to be, so for instance, I would say, okay, no, it does not really happen anymore, but back in the days, most Azure services, when they were just released, did not yet, for instance, support managed identities, right? And so you could have said, okay, I totally need to use that service, but I will use shared access signatures or whatever because I have no other means, right? But then 3 months later, it's supported. Then you have to review IDEOM to say, no, you have to use it this way, right? And so that's an example of why it makes sense to really constantly, or let's say very frequently, review your patterns and so on, because the cloud moves really fast and Kubernetes.
Yeah.
And network security perimeter, right, is, sorry, Matt. So the network security perimeter is a fantastic example of something that should revolutionize how we architect stuff in Azure. I mean, for so long, we've been saying, why do we have to put a virtual network in? And the answer is oftentimes because the customer is comfortable with a virtual network as a boundary of control, as a security perimeter, right? Network security perimeter turns that on its head and says, no, we can do this in a pure PaaS setting, largely based on identity. But for my mind, whilst it's a fantastic innovation, until enough services in Azure support it to give us critical mass, it's not an available option to me in the menu that I normally pick from. So that's one of those, exactly to your point, right? That we'd want to look at that periodically every 6 months or 12 months and go, can we now use it? Sorry, Massimo, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, it's great. So thank you, Rik. And just one more question to jump on what you are saying about this review in general. So my question for you, are you using any tools? So you just, of course, you have your solution architecture, your architecture decision records, and so on. But then are you using, you just go through your design, or are you using a tool like the classic well-architected framework or things like this to review? So how do you impose to yourself a sort of approach, framework, guidelines? So how do you operate your review in this case?
Yeah. You want me to start, Rik?
Sure.
So for me, well, I'm not really using a tool. So of course we're using like the service update and so on, right? So you know that there is something, there are changes. But I think I really try to impose somehow. Of course, it's always to be discussed with the customer, but to say, guys, we need to do that every 6 months, right? And so, or every year, right, maximum. And so, and of course, you would only focus on services where you know that changes happened, of course. You see, and that we know, of course, by the, let's say, notifications you receive, when you have new updates, or of course, as MVPs, we also know a lot of stuff up front, right? So that helps us anticipate as well. So I'm not really using a specific tool, let's say, but I'm trying to impose that cadence, right? To say, okay, if we don't do that, right, then the risk is that you will really use outdated, let's say, patterns moving forward. And that's a risk you take by not doing it.
So I do like the well-architected framework. I think when I'm designing solutions for and with customers, I don't necessarily follow things like CAF and WAF to the letter, but I think there's an enormous amount of value in them because customers are concerned about risk, right? And being able to show how your architecture aligns with things like WAF, I think gives the customer confidence. And it also means that, if I exit the engagement, they can bring somebody else on and go, okay, this was designed in accordance with those architectural pillars that Microsoft have documented. Oftentimes, I'm also dealing with enterprise organizations where, they've got a direct line to a Microsoft technical representative who sits on a call and we have those kinds of conversations about whether they agree or disagree and how well it aligns. So I think there's a lot of value in that. What I do often do, though, is if I'm in with a customer who's trying to follow those things to the letter, often I might find myself challenging them because, again, we're back to that maturity and capability, right? Trying to do everything in some of these frameworks can sometimes be a stretch for the team that you've got and the skills that they have. And often I like to try and help the customer think of their application architecture as being as much of a journey as the development of the application itself, in that it's going to have to evolve. You're going to have to learn new skills and capabilities and help your team grow. And it depends where you are on that journey. Lots of little things, right? I mean, Stephane, you've got in the networking section of that diagram stuff that isn't necessarily an Azure service, but is often a core component of what our customers put in. So they put in HubSpot virtual networking with things like Palo Alto or Cisco. And that's great because they're coming at, the reason they tend to do that is because they're bringing their on-prem skills with them and it helps them accelerate the journey. But oftentimes then they start to change their mind on that as they find that sometimes that can impose constraints on how they operate that HubSpot and how they manage traffic and access to services. And it's perfectly valid to start with what you know and then continue to grow and develop as you learn more.
Just indeed, Massimo, to come. Of course, I'm also using the WAF kind of as a reference, not especially for the review cycle, you see, but of course, you have to use the doc. So I just would say that maybe it's my customers, I don't know, that make things too complex. But sometimes I find some of the reference architectures in the WAF a bit too simple, right, compared to the reality that I can see, especially I would say in the financial industry, pharma sector. You see, highly regulated, where indeed network plays a big role, and so then tends to make things a bit more complex. And I would say especially in the data space. So sometimes you still see, architectures from the WAF, where it's all open, right? Which is typically not the case if you go, with public endpoints. I mean, which is typically not the case if you go in some industries where it's all private. But the private aspect of it makes it much more complex. You see.
Yeah, but also, like the WAF. So I mentioned the WAF also because it doesn't go too much into detail, but it's more, let's say, horizontal. So and one thing. So second thing is an external tool. So if I forgot something throughout my journey, I just have a sort of, a lightweight external audit. But of course, as you were saying, the things it always depends are always so difficult and different regulation and so on. So you need to go then deep in your use case that you implemented over time and see all the changes. So sometimes those frameworks are an helper to facilitate your 6 months or 1 year review, to give you a structure. But then there is nobody better than you that knows about the application, the platform that you build, right? So which kind of angles you have to reevaluate over time.
Maybe one thing, so it's not a tool, but it's something that I always refer to, is the subscription quotas and limits. Right, that's something that whenever I design anything, I always look at this, right? Because they also change over time. And the thing is that, say that you are building an event-driven solution, right, EDA architecture, and then you're dealing with massive amount of messages and so on. You might think, okay, I'm going to use service A or B, but of course you really better check, okay, what is, for instance, the maximum size per entity? If I would take service bus, what is the maximum size of the overall namespace? You see, and then see as well. Really check this before you design anything, because sometimes there could be limitations that you did not expect, right? And so that's always a safe, safe way to make sure that what you build will be future-proof somehow in terms of scalability and non-functional requirements.
Okay. Great. I think we are over for our. We arrived to the end of our episode. I think we knew we could go for hours on this topic, like other topic that we will have in the future, like networking, containers, and so on. We can always consider new episode to go deep into some details. Let us know what would you like to see, and we can get back with Rik and more guests and friends on additional episodes. So for today's everything, I want to say to you, Rik, thank you so much for helping us and having this nice discussion.
It's been an absolute pleasure being here. It's been great talking to you today. Thanks for inviting me, Massimo and Stephane.
Yeah, thank you, Rik. And so indeed, if there are like other requests, would be interesting to, if Rik is also okay, maybe to dive deeper on some topics, Of course, the next episode will dive deeper, infra security is going to be more verticals. But even on solution architecture, we could have other episodes in the future if anyone sees interest there.
And then at the end of our journey, we will do some party. Some ideas will come up and we will meet all together somewhere. Let's see. We never know. Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
And see you on the next episode.
Thanks, Massimo. See you. Bye-bye.